My girlfriend said, my ex-boyfriend and I will go out every weekend because we're friends. If you're insecure, that's not my problem. So I accepted my job transfer to another country and left her alone. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. My name's Enrique. I'm 28 years old. A little over a month ago, I ended a relationship that had lasted about a year with my now ex-girlfriend, Lucretia, who's also 28. For most of our relationship, things were calm. I met Lucretia through some mutual friends. We met at a small gathering one of them organized to celebrate their birthday. I remember we talked a lot that night. She seemed calm, with a good sense of humor and a very direct way of talking. We exchanged numbers and started talking frequently. For the first few months, everything was quite normal. We'd go out to dinner, go to the movies, or just walk around the city. She was working a small company then, but after a few months, she decided to quit her job because she wanted to start her own business. Her idea was to sell personalized mugs and other items like notebooks, keychains, things like that. She said she'd always wanted something of her own and didn't want to spend her life working for someone else. I didn't object. At that time, I thought it was positive for someone to want to try to build something of their own. Plus, my job gave me some financial stability. I'm a branch manager for a well-known company, but I prefer not to mention the name to avoid any problems or misunderstandings. It's not that I'm doing anything wrong. I just prefer to keep some distance between my personal life and my work. When Lucretia decided to quit her job, we talked about it calmly. She said that at first her business probably wouldn't generate stable income and that it would need time to take off. I told her it was no problem. We could work it out practically. That meant that most of the time I covered almost all the expenses. I paid the rent for the apartment where we lived, food, utilities, internet, gas when we went out, practically everything. I'm not saying this to complain. At least at first, I didn't see it as a negative thing. I thought it was a temporary phase while our project got off the ground. For the first few months, there really weren't any major problems. She was very dedicated to her business. She spent time designing, looking for suppliers, watching internet tutorials on printing and product personalization. I worked most of the day, and when I got home, we'd have dinner together and talk about how the day went. Regarding her past, I knew she'd had a long relationship before meeting me. I think they'd been together for several years. However, she always told me they'd ended on good terms and no longer had contact. She never gave me reason to doubt that. In fact, for almost all the time we'd been together, the topic of her ex-boyfriend didn't even come up in important conversations. That's why, when everything started to change, it took me quite by surprise. It all started a few months ago when Lucretia told me some of her old co-workers were organizing a reunion. Apparently, they wanted to get together after a long time without seeing each other. According to her, many had changed jobs or moved, so they wanted to catch up. She asked if I'd mind if she went. I told her I had no problem. I've never been someone who wants to control who their partner goes out with or where they go. If someone needs to ask permission for everything they do, the relationship probably already has a fundamental problem. That night, she went to the reunion and I stayed home. I remember I even told her to enjoy the night and to let me know when she got back, so I'd know she arrived safely. Everything seemed completely normal. She came back a bit late, but it didn't seem strange to me either. It was a social gathering after all. When she arrived, she seemed animated, like when someone reconnects with people they haven't seen in a long time. We talked for a while, and she told me who had been there. In the middle of the conversation, she mentioned something I didn't give much importance to at the time. She told me her ex-boyfriend had also been there. I remember I naturally asked if they'd talked, and she told me yes, they'd chatted for a while. According to her, it was all very normal, like two people greeting each other after a long time. She also explained that their relationship had ended peacefully and there were no hard feelings between them. She told me something like, "We broke up years ago, but we never had problems, it just didn't work out." I didn't see anything strange in that. Many people maintain a cordial relationship with their ex-partners, and it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything more. However, after that reunion, small changes started to occur. At first, they were very subtle things. For example, she started mentioning her ex-boyfriend in some conversations. Comments like he now works somewhere else or was thinking of moving. Nothing particularly important. but he started appearing with some frequency in what she told. One day, she told me they'd exchanged numbers at the reunion to keep in touch with some of her old coworkers. He was among them. I didn't like the idea much, but I didn't say anything at the time. I thought it would probably be something occasional, a message now and then, nothing more. But over time, I started to notice they talked quite frequently. It's not that I checked her phone or anything like that. It was just obvious. Sometimes we were watching a movie and a message would arrive. She'd respond, then another, and another. When I asked her who she was talking to, she naturally told me it was her ex. I asked her why they talked so much, and her answer was quite simple. She said they were friends now. That's when the first argument started. They weren't big fights at first, more like uncomfortable conversations. I told her I thought it was strange they suddenly started talking so often after years without contact. She replied there was nothing weird. They'd simply reconnected at that reunion and had reminisced about old times as coworkers. As the weeks passed, the situation started to become more uncomfortable for me. One of the moments I remember most happened one Saturday morning. Lucretia and I were doing the month shopping at the supermarket. It was something we usually did together, filling the cart, discussing what things were needed at home, that kind of normal routine. While we're checking out some products in one of the aisles, I suddenly heard someone call her name. When I turned around, I saw it was her ex-boyfriend. Before I could react, Lucretia left the cart and walked quickly towards him with an expression that, to be honest, surprised me quite a bit. She seemed extremely excited to see him. She greeted him with a long hug, and they started talking as if they were two people who hadn't seen each other in years. Even though, according to her, they'd been talking by message constantly. I stood by the cart for a few seconds, not knowing quite what to do. Finally, she called me to introduce us. She said something like, "Enrique, this is Daniel." We shook hands and had a brief, quite superficial conversation. Comments about the weather, work, things like that. After a few minutes, he said he had to continue with his shopping and left. When we returned to the cart, I asked her why she'd been so effusive seeing him. Her response was that it was normal to react that way when you meet someone you knew for so many years. I told her it seemed a bit excessive, but she didn't agree. That conversation ended up becoming a small argument, the first of several. Over time, more situations started to arise that made me feel uncomfortable. Nothing was extremely scandalous by itself, but the sum of everything was starting to generate a strange feeling. Meanwhile, the economic situation at home was also starting to generate some pressure. Lucretia's business wasn't working out as she expected. There were weeks when she sold some things, but in general the income was very low or non-existent. That meant I was still covering all the expenses. I never directly reproached her for it, but it was clear that the financial responsibility fell completely on me. Between work, apartment responsibilities, and increasingly frequent arguments about her friendship with her ex-boyfriend, I started to feel that the relationship was changing. One night, I decided to talk about the topic directly. I told her I was uncomfortable with how often she talked to Daniel and some of the situations that were happening. Her response was very clear. She told me he was just a friend. They'd broken up years ago, and if I had a problem with that, then it was my problem. Conversations between them continued frequently. Sometimes she was smiling while typing on her phone. When I asked something, she naturally replied she was talking to Daniel. She said it as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was exaggerating. After all, she constantly repeated there was nothing between them. But the feeling of discomfort didn't disappear. The moment that truly marked a breaking point happened one Friday night. That day, I'd arrived home from work a bit later than usual. It had been a heavy week at the branch, and all I wanted was a quiet dinner and some rest. When I entered the apartment, I noticed Lucretia was getting ready. She had different clothes than she usually wore when she stayed home. She was also packing a small backpack. At first, I thought maybe she was going out with a friend. It didn't seem strange to me. What caught my attention was that she hadn't told me anything before. While putting my things down, I asked her calmly, "Are you going out?" She replied without dwelling too much on the conversation, "Yes." I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water while asking her again, "Who are you going with?" That's when she said something that completely baffled me. Very naturally, she replied, "I'm staying the weekend with my ex and other friends." I remember I stayed silent for a few seconds, hoping she might clarify something more, as if she'd omitted some important detail. But she continued talking normally, as if she were explaining something completely reasonable. "Daniel bought a cabin outside the city," she continued, "so we'll probably have gatherings there every weekend." At that moment, I really didn't know what to say. I was surprised by how directly she mentioned it, as if it were an everyday plan. After a few seconds, I finally replied, "That can't be serious." She looked at me with an expression that mixed surprise and a bit of impatience. "Why not?" I took a deep breath before responding. "Because you're saying you're going to spend the whole weekend in a cabin with your ex-boyfriend?" She frowned slightly. "He won't be the only one," she said. "Other friends will go too." My response was immediate. "That doesn't change much." That's when her attitude changed a bit. She closed the backpack she was packing and leaned against the table. "Here we go again," she said with a tired tone. "I told you many times that he and I are just friends." I felt the conversation was entering the same old pattern, but this time the situation was different. "This isn't the same as talking by messages," I replied. "Are you saying you're going to spend the entire weekend in a cabin with him?" She crossed her arms. "If you're insecure, that's your problem." That phrase bothered me quite a bit. "It's not a question of insecurity," I said. "It's a question of boundaries." She let out a small laugh that sounded more like mockery than humor. "Boundaries? Now you're going to decide who I can spend my time with, too." "I'm not saying that," I replied. "I'm saying it's strange." Her expression changed to a mix of irritation and defiance. "Don't you trust me?" That question took me a second to answer. Trust doesn't mean ignoring uncomfortable situations. She shook her head. "Are you exaggerating?" I tried to explain what I was thinking. "You'll practically be sleeping with him just a few feet away." She immediately replied, "You're exaggerating." Then she added something that was supposed to reassure me. "I told you several other friends will go too." I stared at her before responding, and that should reassure me. Her patience was clearly reaching its limit. "You're completely insecure," she said annoyedly. I tried to stay calm, but it was clear the conversation was escalating. "It's not about insecurity," I repeated. "It's about respect within a relationship." She sighed in frustration. "What's between Daniel and me is long over," she said. Then she said something I honestly didn't expect to hear. "There's no longer any sexual tension between us." I remained silent, but she continued talking as if she were explaining a logic I should understand. "We all know each other already," she said. I felt a strange sensation hearing that phrase, but what came next was even more surprising. "He's seen me naked many, many times," she continued. "Many more than you." For a second I thought I'd misheard, but it didn't end there. "And I've seen him naked many times too," she added. That desire is gone. At that moment, I really didn't know how to react. I didn't expect that kind of comment in the middle of an argument, not just because of the content, but because of how nonchalantly she said it. It was as if she were using that information as an argument to prove there was nothing between them. But the effect was exactly the opposite. I felt a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "Did you really just say that as if it should reassure me?" I asked. She shrugged. "It's the reality." I was still trying to process what I'd just heard. "That doesn't make the situation better." She picked up her backpack from the table. "I'm not going to keep arguing about this." She walked towards the door while I was still standing in the living room. Before leaving, she stopped for a second, turned to me, and said one last thing. "Take this weekend to reflect on your insecurity and your fragile masculinity." Then she opened the door and left the apartment. The sound of the door closing was the last thing I heard. For several minutes, I remained completely still in the living room. I wasn't shouting, I wasn't hitting things, I wasn't doing anything dramatic. I was simply trying to process what had just happened. The argument had been more intense than the previous ones, but what really made me think was the way she'd handled the whole situation. She didn't seem to consider there was anything inappropriate about spending weekends in a cabin with her ex-boyfriend, nor did she seem to understand why that could generate discomfort in a relationship. And the things she said during the argument didn't exactly help reassure me. That night, I sat on the sofa and tried to think calmly. I didn't want to react impulsively, but I also knew something in the relationship had changed quite clearly. While I was sitting there, an idea began to form in my head. An idea that had been in the background for some time, but which until then I hadn't seriously considered. However, after what had just happened, it started to appear a very real possibility. That night, after Lucretia left the apartment, I stayed in the living room for a long time. I didn't turn on the TV or do anything in particular. I just kept thinking. I didn't text her, nor did I call her. I knew any conversation at that moment would only turn into another argument, so I decided not to do anything. I made a simple dinner, checked a couple of work emails, and finally went to sleep. Surprisingly, I slept quite well. I don't know if it was accumulated tiredness or simply the fact that I no longer had the energy to keep thinking about the topic, but I fell asleep with relative ease. The next morning I got up early like any other day. It was Saturday, and normally it would have been a quieter day, but I had some pending work things I wanted to get ahead on from home. While having breakfast, I saw I had a message from Lucretia. It was quite long. I opened it and started reading the message. It said, "Here I am in the cabin, love. We fought really badly before I left, and believe me, it hurts a lot that we said goodbye like that." I kept reading. "I want you to know that I love you and adore everything you do for me. I know this is hard to accept, but believe me, I'm only coming here for my friends." I continued scrolling down the message. "I won't do anything wrong. I'm different. I'm not like other girls." The next part caught my attention. "I'm not like those unfaithful girls. I'm unique among all of them. I'm faithful to you, to your love." I kept reading. "This is a test for our love, and we must overcome it. We have to move forward together." Then came another phrase, "Believe me, in a month these outings will become a habit, and we'll be laughing at our insecurities in the future." The message ended with a quite simple phrase, "I love you." When I finished reading it, I stared at the screen for a few seconds. I didn't reply. I put away the phone and continued with my day. A few hours later, I had to go to the branch to review some documents. While I was in the office, I remembered something that had been on my mind for weeks. Months ago, my boss had made me a proposal. The company was opening a factory in collaboration with a partner in China. It was an important project because they were looking to expand operations and needed someone with experience to help organize the start of everything. For that reason, they'd been evaluating some experienced managers within the company. I was one of them, not only because of the years I've been working there, but because something uncommon in the company appeared on my resume. I spoke several languages. Besides Spanish, I spoke English, French, and Chinese. I learned Chinese years ago out of personal interest. I never imagined I'd actually use it professionally, but apparently that detail caught quite a bit of attention when they started looking for candidates for the transfer. My boss had called me to his office a few weeks earlier to discuss the matter. The proposal was generally simple: temporarily transfer to China to help organize the initial operation of a new factory. The initial contract would be for 6 months. After that time, the company would evaluate if I wanted to return or if I prefer to stay permanently. The economic package was quite good. It included company-paid accommodation, a considerable salary increase, and other additional benefits. When they proposed it to me, the truth is I was interested. It was an important professional opportunity, but at that moment I hesitated. The main reason was Lucretia. I didn't want to go to another country for months and leave her alone. I thought that could affect the relationship, so I told my boss I needed time to think about it. He replied he understood, and I could take a few weeks to decide. While I was in my office that Saturday, I remember that conversation. I also remembered that my boss had asked me to give him a definitive answer soon, because if I rejected the offer, they needed to find another manager who could take the position. I sat in front of the desk thinking about everything that had happened in recent weeks, the arguments, the uncomfortable conversations, the plan to spend weekends in a cabin with her ex-boyfriend, the message I just read that morning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something quite clear. I wasn't willing to continue living that kind of situations. It wasn't the life I wanted to have. I didn't want to spend months arguing about things that for me were basic boundaries within a relationship. At that moment, I made a decision. I got up from the chair, walked down the hallway, and went directly to my boss's office. I knocked on the door. "Come in," I heard from inside. I opened the door and entered. "Good morning, sir," I said. He looked up from some documents he was reviewing. Good morning, Enrique. I sat down in front of his desk. I wanted to give you my answer about the offer of the transfer to China. My boss put the papers aside and looked at me attentively. Good, he said. What have you decided? Then he added, remember, we'll give you accommodation. The initial contract will be for 6 months. If you decide to come back in the end, we'll look for another manager who can go later. But if you decide to stay, you'll have accommodation indefinitely in addition to the salary increase. I nodded. I accept to go, sir. My boss smiled immediately. Congratulations, Enrique. I always knew you wouldn't disappoint me. Then he checked something on his computer and added, the flight leaves tomorrow at 5 in the morning. That took me a bit by surprise. Tomorrow? Yes, he replied. The project is already underway, and they need someone there as soon as possible. Then he continued, we'll give you 3 days to adapt to the place. Afterwards, you'll start working formally. I nodded. I left his office with a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I knew I'd just made an important decision for my career. On the other hand, I also knew that decision was going to change many things in my personal life. That same day, I started organizing the basics. I packed a suitcase with what was necessary. I didn't have much time to plan too much. Lucretia didn't return to the apartment that Saturday. We didn't talk either. On Sunday morning, very early, I left for the airport. The flight was long. For much of the journey, I was thinking about everything that was happening, not just work, but the relationship that was probably coming to an end. When I finally arrived in China, everything seemed quite surprising to me. It was a completely different place from what I was used to. The airport was huge, the city was full of modern buildings, and the number of people was impressive. While waiting for the transport the company had sent for me, I felt my phone vibrate. I looked at the screen. It was a message. The name that appeared in the notification was Lucretia's. It said, Love, where are you? You're supposed to rest on Sundays. I brought you some food from the reunion. Did you go out somewhere? I read the message a couple of times. For a few seconds, I thought about whether I should reply or just ignore it, but I finally decided to answer. I wrote something simple. I'm a bit far away. The response came almost immediately. What time are you coming back? I looked at the message, and for the first time since everything had started, I felt a kind of strange calm. I knew exactly what I was going to say. I replied, maybe I'll be a while. I think more or less about 6 months, maybe more. Only a few seconds passed before my phone started ringing. It was her. I answered. What are you talking about? Was the first thing she said. Her tone of voice was full of confusion. I breathed calmly before responding. I'm in China. There was a silence on the other end of the call. What? I accepted the job transfer. I explained, the one I mentioned to you a long time ago. I could hear her breathing change. No, it can't be, she said. You promised you wouldn't accept that for the relationship. I remained silent for a few seconds before responding. I changed my mind. That was enough for her to start crying. How could you do that? She said through tears. You said you didn't want to leave me alone. I replied calmly. I also said I didn't feel comfortable with your friendship with your ex. She didn't respond immediately. I continued speaking. If you couldn't accept something as simple as setting boundaries with your ex-boyfriend to take care of the relationship, I don't see why I should reject an important opportunity in my job. On the other side, only her agitated breathing could be heard. This isn't the same, she finally said. For me, it is. There was a moment of silence. Then she said something I honestly didn't expect to be her first concern. And what's going to happen to the apartment? I didn't respond immediately. She continued. The rent, the utilities, all that you paid. Her voice no longer sounded so much sad as worried. I guess you'll have to take care of it now, I replied. What do you mean me? She said with obvious nervousness. You know my business isn't generating enough money yet. I didn't say anything. She kept talking. So, will you send me money? For a moment I thought she was joking, but her tone was completely serious. I couldn't help it. I started laughing. It wasn't a small or nervous laugh. It was a pretty loud laugh. She remained silent. Do you think it's funny? She asked annoyedly. I kept laughing a few more seconds before responding, yes. There was another awkward silence. I didn't add anything else. I simply hung up the call. Then I opened the chat and wrote a last message. We're done. I sent it and then blocked her. I also blocked her number for calls. There was no more conversation. The truth is I didn't have to worry too much about the apartment. When Lucretia and I moved there, most of the furniture was already included with the rent. The sofa, the bed, the table, practically everything. There weren't many things that were truly mine, just my clothes, some personal items, and a couple of small kitchen things. I even remember I left some glasses in the cupboard, because honestly it didn't make sense to take them. I didn't feel I was losing anything important. When I arrived at the apartment the company assigned me in China, everything was completely different from my previous life. It was a modern place, near the factory where I would start working. The first few days were quite intense. I had to adapt to a new environment, meet the local team, and start organizing many things for the project. But despite the tiredness, I felt good, much calmer than I'd felt in recent months. There were no arguments, no constant tension, just work and a clear routine. A few weeks passed. One day, I received a message from a number I didn't have saved. It was one of Lucretia's friends. She wrote something like, "Hi, Enrique. I don't know if I should write to you, but I think you should know that Lucretia isn't well." I didn't reply. The message continued. "She's very depressed since you left. Also, she's having money problems." I read the complete message. According to her, Lucretia was going through a very difficult time. Her business wasn't working, and apparently, she was having trouble paying for the apartment and other expenses. After finishing reading the message, I made a simple decision. I blocked that number too. I didn't feel guilty doing it. The relationship had ended. I had made my decision, and she had made hers long before. Since then, I've focused completely on my work. The factory project is progressing well, and my boss seems quite satisfied with the results so far. Sometimes I think about how things would have been if I'd made a different decision, but the truth is I don't regret it. At some point, I understood something quite simple. A relationship only works when both people are willing to maintain certain boundaries. When one of them starts treating those boundaries as an insecurity problem, it's likely the end is near. And in my case, that end came just when I decided to get on a plane to another continent.